This tutorial is designed to help you think through the process of finding the information you're going to need for the speeches and for the research assignments that you're given in speech class. As you're doing this, you're going to think about the fact that a speech is built up of two basic pieces of content. Organizational content, you can think about that as the bones of the speech. It helps us to understand what is being said, when it's being said. The other part is the supporting content. That's the muscles of the speech. And supporting content is made up of supporting material. Your book talks about what is the types of supporting material. You want to read that in the textbook, but just to give you a reminder overview, you're looking for things like definitions. And when we talk about definitions, we're talking about definitions of particular terms that are central to your speech. So think about the denotation of a particular word, the connotations of the words you're using, the denotation being the dictionary definition of that word. But also think about operational definitions. There are certain terms like social capital or cornea donation or mental math that are not defined by defining social and then capital, but the term social capital means something together. Same thing with mental math. It isn't as simple as defining the word mental and defining the word math, but if we're going to use the word mental math or the phrase mental math, then you're going to talk about defining that as mathematical calculations that are done in one's mind rather than using pen and paper or calculator. Facts are things that are objectively verifiable. You also have examples and illustrations where, as you're talking along, you're going to give an example of how a concept works. For instance, through this presentation series of tutorials, I'm going to use examples of speeches that I've heard, and particularly I'm going to keep coming back to the example of mental math. So if I were doing an informative or persuasive speech over mental math, this is how I would use the process that I'm unfolding. So that's an example of an example. Stories, where you tell longer descriptive stories, and those are things that help support a speech. And then, of course, we come to statistics. Statistics, we can talk about those really in three different ways. Descriptive statistics tell us exactly the number of a particular issue or topic, the exact number, for instance, of colleges in the state of Texas, or the number of accredited schools in the state of Texas. Inferential statistics is what you get when you do survey research, or rather experimental research, and you say based on a survey or an experiment done with X number of people, we might conclude that the typical college freshman, for instance, has these certain characteristics or respond this way under these circumstances. And then a survey is just that. You've taken a survey of a number of people, or an organization has surveyed a certain number of doctors or college students or likely voters, and draws out conclusions based on what they say. Inferential statistics is a little bit more complicated than just what I described. It has to do with complicated statistical analyses of data that is taken from a sample set. Testimonial evidence is quotations, so we'll use quotations from people either who are experts in their field or who are particularly involved in that. And so basically testimonial evidence is what we're talking about is there is a quotation. And generally my advice to students is not to quote someone unless that person says it better than they could say it on their own. Otherwise, they can summarize what a person has said. And that's also a form of testimonial evidence, is summarization. We'll talk a little bit more detail about supporting materials another time, but this is just to give you a sense of, as you're doing the research for your speech, what are you looking for? You're looking for definitions of particular terms, facts that can be useful in making your point, examples and illustrations, stories that might illustrate it, statistical data that helps to validate your point, and then quotations that are particularly meaningful, or even explanations that come from an expert that you can summarize but still attribute to that expert. So some criteria for evaluating the supporting material that you find. You go to the library or you go onto the internet, and you're going to be looking for that information. So what is it that you'd use to determine whether it's good or not? First one you will look for is it credible? And the marks of credibility again, are found in your book, but this has to do with, have they done their research reliably? Are they following logical processes? Does it come from a trustworthy, unbiased source? Second thing you want to look for is recent. Is the information been produced in the last few years, particularly statistical data? You want as recent a set of reliable information as you can find. Is it reliable? That is it was the research conducted, or was the evidence found in a manner that's consistent with academic standards at college level? And then finally, identifiable. This is probably the biggest thing that you're going to want to make sure that you do, is that you make sure that you know who said it, who they're working for when they said it, that you can find and put your fingers on the data again. And this is made incredibly more complicated in the internet age, where we're very accustomed to running a simple Google search and then taking whatever we find and just using it as fact. Wikipedia is one of the problems with Wikipedia. Even though I use Wikipedia quite often to get a general definition of something, as far as an academic source, it's not reliable. It's because it's not identifiable. We don't know who is contributing that information. However, they will link at the bottom of a Wikipedia article to identifiable articles, and those are helpful to trace out as you're doing your research. Just some general thoughts concerning going into the process of finding your information. One is to have your research, your goal in sight as you're doing the research. For instance, if you're doing a persuasive speech, I'm going to teach persuasive speech models like problem solution benefits model or motivated sequence, which takes a speech through 5 steps of attention, need, satisfaction, visualization, and action. And there are types of supporting material that are relevant to each part of those speech models. So if you know you're going to be doing a persuasive speech, you know you're going to have to validate the problem, for instance, or in a problem solution benefit speech, or you know you're going to have to substantiate the need for the change that you're recommending. Then as you're doing your research, you can begin to think about, well, I need to find evidence that accomplishes that goal. Second general piece of advice that I'm going to give you is to move between reading and finding sources, vacillate back and forth between those two processes. This is something I learned the hard way, where I would go and I'd find as much material as I could get my hands on, and then I would lie to myself and take it home and say, I'll read this at home, and then I would never read it. And a lot of times I would end up taking home stuff that wasn't relevant to what I was looking for. So whenever you find a source of information, scan the stuff before you print it, or make copies of it before you check it out to take it home, and see if it actually does fit what you're doing. And in the best circumstances, what you'll do is you'll find a good introductory article that helps you to orient yourself to the topic. If you can read that first, then it will help you to do the rest of your research, because you'll be familiar with that terminology. And so that's another piece of advice. Just kind of know what your goal is going into that. Think about reading material when you get your hands on it, and process it fairly quickly. You may decide that it's worth your time, but it's longer than you have at that moment, and so you will then take it home and read it later. But as best you can, begin processing as soon as you get your hands on sources. And then the third piece of advice I would give you, just in general, is to think about the language that you need to use in order to do a speech search. We think about subordinate terms and superordinate terms, so that if I'm doing my speech, for instance, on catfish, catfish is a subordinate term to freshwater game fish, and that would be a subcategory or subordinate term to freshwater fish, which is, of course, a subordinate term to fish. So if you're thinking about how you go down a list of subordinate terms, it would be fish, freshwater game fish, and then catfish. As well, if you're thinking about the superordinate term, you've got, for instance, listening. If I were doing a speech on listening, or empathic listening, rather, my superordinate term would be listening. So it goes up the scale of ambiguity. Empathic listening is a subcategory of listening in general. So subordinate terms, more specific, superordinate terms, more general. And as you're doing your research, you're going to want to think about, then you may want to narrow your search to subordinate terms that will help you to pinpoint the information that you're absolutely trying to find. Or if you're not retrieving much by searching for your specific topic, you might think about searching in a subordinate term topic and finding information there. As well, you're going to want to think about related terms. If I'm doing, again, the speech on empathic listening, then my related terms might be helping talk or supportive listening. So those are just some general suggestions that I have for you as you're beginning to do your research. Good luck.